The rain fell in a relentless sheet over the grand streets of Paris, blurring the glow of the old-world lamplights and turning the sidewalks into rivers of shimmering gold. Ivy Monroe clutched her thin coat tighter around her as she hurried down Rue de Rivoli, her boots splashing through puddles, her heart pounding louder than the storm overhead. Everything she owned was stuffed into the battered satchel bouncing against her hip. A handful of clothes, a few notebooks, and a crumpled eviction notice that had been the final merciless blow. She had nowhere to go, no one left to call. Her once bright dreams of a career as a freelance art journalist had withered to ash beneath the weight of overdue bills and silent phones. Tonight she was just another invisible soul swallowed by the rain. Yet somehow she found herself stopping, outside a place she barely recognized, a quiet corner cafe, its golden light spilling onto the darkened street. Through the window she saw warmth, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Life. Desperation pushed her forward. Inside, the world shifted. It was like stepping into another universe, dry, vibrant, full of music and the scent of freshly baked bread. Ivy stood there for a moment, dripping and shivering, unsure whether she had the right to claim even a square inch of it. Then a voice, low and smooth as velvet, cut through her haze. "You look like a ghost," the man said. Ivy turned toward him and found herself staring into the most arresting pair of blue-gray eyes she had ever seen. They belonged to a man sitting alone at the bar, a glass of dark liquor cradled in his elegant hand. His tailored suit fit his lean frame perfectly, and his expression was both amused and something harder to name, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Lucien Moreau. Even before he spoke his name, she knew it. Everyone in Paris knew of him. The billionaire investor, the ruthless tycoon who had built empires and destroyed rivals with a single stroke of his pen. A man with a reputation for being as cold and impenetrable as the stone gargoyles perched atop Notre Dame. And now he was looking at her, really looking at her, as if she were a puzzle he intended to solve. "Sit," Lucien said, gesturing to the seat beside him with an effortless command. Ivy hesitated only a moment before obeying. What did she have to lose? The bartender slid a steaming cup of coffee toward her, and Ivy wrapped her frozen hands around it, letting the heat seep into her bones. She didn't speak, she didn't know what to say. And Lucien, for his part, seemed content to simply watch her. Minutes stretched between them, heavy with something electric and unspoken. "You're not from here," he said at last, his voice dipping into something almost curious. Ivy shook her head. "Chicago," she managed, "came for work, stayed for dreams." Lucien's mouth quirked slightly, the ghost of a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Dreams," he repeated. "Dangerous things." The words hung between them, bitter and true. She could have asked why he was alone, why a man with the world at his feet would spend a rainy night nursing a drink in a half-empty cafe. But she didn't. Instinctively, she understood that Lucien Moreau was a man who answered only the questions he chose to hear. Instead, she found herself saying something far more reckless. "Are you always this charming to drowned rats?" The corner of his mouth lifted a little higher this time, a shadow of a smirk. "Only the ones who look like they've forgotten how to ask for help." The words pierced her defenses in a way she hadn't expected. For a moment, Ivy wanted to cry, not from sadness but from the terrifying tenderness of being seen when she had tried so hard to become invisible. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the way Lucien looked at her, not with pity but with something sharper, something that challenged her to fight for herself even when the world had given her no reason to. Or maybe it was destiny, because that night, something impossible happened. Lucien reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small crisp envelope. He slid it across the bar toward her with a deliberateness that made her heart stutter. Inside, Ivy found a card, a name, an address, and a sum of money scrawled in neat, ruthless handwriting. $500,000. She looked up at him bewildered. "I need something," Lucien said, his gaze locking with hers, unblinking. "Something only you can give." Her mouth went dry. She knew she should run. She knew this man, this offer, this night. They were all dangerous, but she stayed. "What do you want?" she whispered. His reply was simple, terrifying. "A child." Ivy's breath caught. "Not love, not companionship. A transaction." He continued, his voice steady as stone. "You will live at my estate until the child is born. You will want for nothing. Afterward, you will receive the agreed-upon amount. No questions, no attachments." The rain hammered harder against the windows. Outside, the city throbbed with endless possibilities, but none of them would erase her debts. None of them would give her back the life she had fought so hard to build. Ivy Monroe had spent her entire life dreaming of freedom. Now for the first time she understood how desperate freedom could look. And somehow sitting across from Lucienne Moreau, she realized that the worst mistake wasn't risking everything. It was risking nothing at all. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucien's eyes darkened, something unreadable flashing across his face. "Because," he said quietly, "you're not afraid of broken things." The words struck a chord so deep within her that she couldn't breathe. Without another thought, Ivy picked up the pen he offered, her signature scrolled across the contract like a prayer or a curse. And just like that, the deal was made. A storm raged outside, tearing across the Parisian sky. Inside, in the small golden cocoon of the cafe, two strangers sealed a pact that would change the course of their lives forever. Neither of them knew that what had begun as a transaction would soon ignite a fire, powerful enough to consume every wall, every fear, every broken piece they had ever tried to hide. It was the beginning of something neither dared to name, and it all started with a choice made in the rain. Ivy left the cafe that night, not just with a contract in her hand, but with a storm raging inside her. She wandered through the slick Parisian streets for hours, the rain soaking her skin, her hair clinging to her face. The idea of selling a part of herself, the most intimate, sacred part, was both horrifying and strangely liberating. What would her mother say if she knew? Ivy could almost hear the ghost of her voice, scolding and pleading all at once. "You were meant for more, Ivy. You were meant to build something with love, not desperation." But love hadn't paid her overdue rent. Love hadn't stopped the bank from freezing her accounts. Survival demanded choices no one could understand unless they had stood where she stood. The next morning, Ivy found herself at the gates of Lucien's estate, a sprawling chateau on the outskirts of Paris, its stone facade dripping with ivy and history. It was the kind of place that looked as though it had been plucked straight out of a dream or a nightmare, depending on who you asked. She hesitated at the massive wrought iron gate, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed the call button. A voice crackled through the speaker. "Mademoiselle Monroe?" "Yes," she croaked, hating how small she sounded. The gate swung open without another word. A black car was waiting for her just inside, sleek and silent. As she climbed in, the driver, a stern man in a dark suit, offered her a curt nod and nothing else. No words, no judgment, just cold efficiency. The car wound its way up a long, tree-lined driveway until the mansion came into full view. Ivy swallowed hard. She had seen castles like this in movies, in history books, but never up close. It was both beautiful and oppressive, like a cage made of gold. Lucien was waiting for her at the top of the marble staircase, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. He wore a charcoal grey suit, no tie, the top two buttons of his shirt undone. Even in his own home, he was the embodiment of control. "I trust your accommodations will be sufficient," he said as she approached, his voice cool and formal. Ivy blinked up at him, trying to find her footing. "I haven't seen them yet." Lucien's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. "Then let's rectify that." He led her through the grand entrance hall, the sound of her damp sneakers squeaking against the polished floors making her wince. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the walls were lined with paintings that must have been worth more than her entire existence. At the end of a long hallway, he opened the door and stepped aside to let her enter first. The room was breathtaking, a canopied bed with soft white linens, French doors that opened onto a balcony overlooking the manicured gardens, a fireplace flickering with a low, inviting fire. Ivy dropped her bag at the foot of the bed, too stunned to speak. "This is too much," she finally managed. Lucien stepped closer, his presence filling the room like a tide she couldn't escape. "You're carrying my child," he said simply. "You deserve to be comfortable." The words were transactional, pragmatic, yet something flickered in his eyes, something that suggested this was about more than mere duty. Ivy turned away, pretending to admire the view from the balcony so he wouldn't see how much his words shook her. "Thank you," she said quietly. Lucien nodded once and moved to leave, but at the door he paused. "There are conditions," he said without looking back. "You will not leave the grounds without my permission. You will have regular medical checkups, and you will not engage in any activities that could endanger yourself or the child." His tone was sharp, almost harsh, but Ivy understood. This was business to him, a transaction, and she was a part of it now. "I understand," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. For a moment, Lucien lingered, as if he wanted to say more. Then, with a curt nod, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving Ivy alone in a room that was both sanctuary and prison. Days bled into each other after that. Lucien was rarely home, always off handling his empire, leaving Ivy to wander the vast estate alone. She explored the endless gardens, the grand library, the hidden nooks and forgotten courtyards. But loneliness was a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of Lucien when he returned late at night, his silhouette framed against the library's tall windows, a drink in his hand, his posture tight with exhaustion. He never sought her out, never asked after her. Yet Ivy felt his presence like a gravitational force, always pulling at the edges of her mind. She started painting again, using old supplies she found tucked away in one of the unused wings. It was clumsy at first, her hands out of practice, her spirit battered. But slowly something inside her began to unfurl. Colors bled onto canvas, stormy blues, fierce reds, soft golds. One evening, after a particularly vivid session, Ivy found herself wandering into the library. She hadn't meant to seek him out. She told herself she was just looking for a book, a distraction. But Lucien was there, as she somehow knew he would be. He looked up from his desk as she entered, his gaze sharpening with something she couldn't quite name. "You paint," he said. Not a question, but a statement. Ivy flushed. "A little." Lucien set down his pen, his hands steepling together. "Bring one of your paintings tomorrow. I wish to see it." It was not a request, it was a command. And despite herself, Ivy found that she didn't mind. Because somewhere between the storm and the silence, between the ruined dreams and reckless hope, a new seed was beginning to take root. Not love, not yet, but something equally dangerous. Something Ivy knew neither of them could afford to name. The days that followed were quieter, yet underneath the silence there was an invisible current pulling Ivy and Lucien into each other's orbit. They were two strangers bound by a contract, yet something more dangerous and intimate simmered just below the surface. Ivy spent her mornings exploring the chateau grounds, her fingers trailing over the ancient stone walls, her mind chasing half-forgotten dreams of freedom. She often found herself in the neglected greenhouse behind the estate, a glass building overtaken by vines and moss, wild roses blooming untamed along the paths. She loved it there, among the chaos and life. One afternoon, while Ivy was carefully untangling a stubborn vine from an overturned pot, she heard footsteps approaching. She straightened, wiping dirt-streaked hands on her jeans, only to find Lucien standing at the entrance, his silhouette sharp against the dappled sunlight. "You've made this place your sanctuary," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Ivy smiled despite herself. It needed a little attention, like some people. Lucien's mouth twitched in the faintest hint of amusement. "I suppose that's your specialty, breathing life into the abandoned." For a long beat they simply looked at each other, neither willing to move, as if afraid the fragile moment would shatter. Then Lucien cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "I have arranged a visit with the doctor tomorrow morning. You'll be accompanied." Ivy nodded, sensing the stiffness in his posture, the unspoken words he held back. "Thank you," she said softly, her gratitude genuine. No one had worried about her in a long time, not without strings attached. Lucien hesitated before adding, "If you need anything, let the staff know." And with that, he turned and disappeared down the path, leaving Ivy alone with the blooming wild roses and the strange ache in her chest. That night she couldn't sleep. The rain returned, tapping gently against her balcony doors. Restless, Ivy wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped outside, the cold air stealing her breath. From her perch, she could see a single light still burning in the library below. Lucien, drawn by an impulse she didn't understand, Ivy made her way down the grand staircase, the marble floor cold against her bare feet. She pushed open the library door and found him there, a whiskey glass in one hand, an open ledger on the desk before him. He looked up, and for a moment something raw flashed across his face, something vulnerable and lonely. "I couldn't sleep," Ivy confessed, hugging the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Lucien gestured wordlessly to the seat across from him. She crossed the room and sat, the heavy silence settling between them like a third presence. Minutes passed, the only sounds the ticking of an ancient clock and the crackle of the fire. Finally, Lucien spoke. "This arrangement, it's not ideal, for either of us." Ivy's laugh was soft, self-deprecating. "You think?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You are braver than I expected, Ivy Monroe." Her heart stumbled over itself at the way he said her name, like it meant something more than just a business deal. I didn't feel brave when I signed that contract, she admitted, staring into the flames. I felt trapped, cornered, terrified. Lucian's fingers tightened around his glass. I offered you a way out. Ivy turned to him, her eyes fierce despite the softness of her voice. You offered me another kind of prison, Lucian. A prettier one, maybe, but still a cage. He flinched, ever so slightly, and for a wild, reckless moment, Ivy wanted to take it back, to smooth over the hurt she saw flicker across his features. Instead, she stood up. I'm not ungrateful, she said, her voice gentler now. But don't pretend this is something it's not. Lucien rose as well, towering over her, his eyes dark and unreadable. And what do you believe this is, Ivy? She swallowed hard, her pulse roaring in her ears. A transaction. A solution to a problem. Lucien studied her for a long moment, then nodded once sharply, as if sealing himself off. Very well. Without another word, he turned away, his shoulders rigid, and Ivy fled the library before the tears burning behind her eyes could fall. The next morning, she almost didn't show up for the doctor's appointment. Pride and pain battled inside her, but practicality won. She had made a choice, and choices came with consequences. A black car awaited her once again, the same silent driver at the wheel. The city blurred past in muted shades of grey and gold as they sped toward a private clinic tucked away near Montmartre. The appointment was efficient and clinical. Blood tests, ultrasounds, a stern lecture about prenatal vitamins. Lucien didn't accompany her, but Ivy wasn't surprised. She wouldn't have known what to do if he had. As she dressed afterward, pulling on her sweater with slow, deliberate movements, the doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, touched her arm gently. You're healthy. The baby is healthy, she said with a warm smile. That's what matters. Ivy forced a smile in return but said nothing, because health wasn't the only thing that mattered, not when her heart felt so bruised, so fragile. Later, back at the estate, she found a note waiting for her on the nightstand. Dinner, 7 o'clock. Formal attire. No signature, but it didn't need one. Lucien Ivy stared at the note for a long time, her emotions a tangled mess. Was this another command? Another part of the arrangement? Or was it something more? She didn't know. But at 6:30, she stood before the mirror, smoothing the folds of a simple black dress she had found in the closet. It clung to her curves, accentuating the slight swell of her belly. She had pulled her hair up, letting a few loose strands frame her face, and applied just enough makeup to hide the sleepless shadows beneath her eyes. When she descended the staircase, she found Lucien waiting at the foot, dressed in a black suit that fit him like armor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lucien offered his arm, and Ivy, after a heartbeat's hesitation, took it. He led her to a small dining room she had never seen before, an intimate space with a single table set for two, a fire crackling in the hearth, soft music playing in the background. It was beautiful, thoughtful, painfully so. They ate, in near silence, the clink of silverware against porcelain the only sound between them. It wasn't until dessert, a delicate creme brulee topped with caramelized sugar, that Lucien finally broke the quiet. You don't trust me, he said, his voice low. Ivy met his gaze steadily. Should I? Lucien's jaw tightened. I never promised you love, Ivy. Only security. And yet you expect loyalty, obedience. She set her spoon down carefully, her hand trembling slightly. You expect me to pretend this is enough. Lucien leaned back in his chair, studying her with those piercing blue eyes that saw too much and yet not enough. I expect honesty, he said finally. Ivy exhaled a shaky breath, the tension between them almost unbearable. Then here's honesty. I don't know if I can do this. Lucien's hands curled into fists against the table, but his voice was steady. You can. His certainty should have angered her. Instead, it made something inside her fracture. I don't want to be a ghost in this house, she whispered. I don't want to disappear the moment I'm no longer useful to you. Lucien's expression shifted, something raw and furious flashing across his face. You are not disposable, he said harshly. You are not a convenience. Then what am I? She demanded, standing up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. Tell me, Lucien. Because I need to know. For a moment it seemed as though he wouldn't answer, that he would retreat into the fortress he had built around himself. But then he rose too, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. "You're the only person who has dared to see me," he said, his voice rough. "The only one who doesn't flinch or flatter or lie." Ivy stared up at him breathless. "I see you," she said quietly. "But it's not enough, is it? Not for either of us." Lucian's hand lifted as if to touch her cheek, then fell back to his side. "No," he said, so low she barely heard him. "It's not." And with that, the fragile connection between them snapped. Ivy fled the dining room, the hem of her black dress trailing behind her like a broken promise. Upstairs, she collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in the pillows, letting the tears fall at last. In the library below, Lucian poured himself a drink with hands that shook more than he cared to admit. They were both prisoners, he realized. Not of contracts or debts, but of fears they had never learned how to conquer. And somehow, against all logic, against all reason, they were each other's only hope of escape. The first flutter came on a golden afternoon when Ivy wandered alone through the neglected gardens. She was bending over to pluck a stubborn weed from the overgrown rosebeds when she felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible ripple low in her belly. She froze, her hand still buried in the earth, her breath catching sharply. For a moment she thought she imagined it, but then it came again. A delicate whisper of life moving inside her. Her heart slammed against her ribs so loud she was sure the entire chateau could hear it. Tears blurred her vision. In the months of cold silences, wary glances and half-spoken truths, Ivy had nearly forgotten what all of this was really about. Not debts or contracts or impossible expectations, but the life blooming within her. A new beginning, fragile and miraculous. She sat back on her heels, pressing both palms gently over her stomach. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I guess you're saying hello." The sudden awareness of the baby made everything else sharper. The sunlight filtering through the wild hedges, the distant murmur of the fountain, the scent of damp earth after a morning rain. Life was still happening, all around her, no matter how broken or bruised she felt. Later that evening, she sat curled in the window seat of her bedroom, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring out at the dusky skyline of Paris. She wondered if she should tell Lucian. Part of her wanted to keep the moment to herself, to tuck it away like a secret treasure. But another part, the lonelier, more vulnerable part, longed to share it with him. When a knock came at the door, soft and hesitant, Ivy startled. She crossed the room and opened it to find Lucian standing there, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored slacks, tension lining every inch of his tall frame. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, holding up a covered silver tray. It was such a simple gesture, but it nearly undid her. She stepped aside silently, allowing him to enter. He set the tray down on the small table by the fireplace, lifting the lid to reveal a simple meal: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, a small bowl of strawberries. Nothing elaborate, but everything chosen with care. Lucian watched her, an almost cautious hope flickering in his storm-grey eyes. "You should eat more. For the baby." The way he said it so quietly made her throat tighten. "I felt it move today," Ivy said, sitting down slowly, cradling her hands around her belly. Lucian stiffened. "Already?" She nodded, smiling through the sudden rush of emotion. "It was tiny, like butterfly wings." For a long moment, Lucian said nothing. Then slowly, he lowered himself into the armchair across from her, his face carved in something deeper than his usual aloofness. "May I?" he asked, his voice gruff. Ivy hesitated only a second before rising and walking to him. Wordlessly, she guided his hand to the small swell of her abdomen. At first there was nothing, just the tense electric silence between them. Then, there, a faint fluttering nudge. Lucian's fingers tensed, his eyes widened, and for the briefest second all the walls he built around himself collapsed. A soft, almost wonder-struck smile touched his mouth. So fleeting Ivy might have thought she imagined it if not for the lingering tenderness in his gaze. "It's real," he whispered. Ivy nodded, her throat too tight for words. They stayed like that for several minutes, bound together not by contracts or obligations, but by the fragile miracle pulsing between them. That night, Ivy slept better than she had in months. In the days that followed, an unspoken truce settled between them. Lucian became less distant, though he never said much. His presence shifted from cold overseer to something quieter, steadier. He would appear in small ways. A plate of fresh fruit left by her bed, a favorite novel from her childhood on her nightstand, a soft cashmere blanket for when she curled up in the library. Tiny gestures, almost clumsy, but impossibly precious. And Ivy, for her part, found herself reaching back. She organized the dusty library into a semblance of order, smiling to herself when she discovered Lucian's childhood books tucked away among the heavy volumes of law and finance. She coaxed the greenhouse into tentative life, tending the wild roses until they bloomed brighter than they had in years. They were building something together, without meaning to. A delicate, precarious bridge between two battered hearts. One evening, as they sat in the garden sipping tea beneath the stars, Ivy dared to ask the question that had been haunting her since the first night they met. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have chosen anyone." Lucien stared into his cup for a long time before answering. "Because you looked at me," he said finally. "And you didn't see the money or the name. You saw me. And you didn't flinch." Ivy blinked back sudden tears, unprepared for the rawness of his confession. "You scare me sometimes," she admitted. Lucien's mouth twisted into a wry smile. "Good. You should." But Ivy shook her head. "Not because of who you are. Because of how much I want to believe you're more than the mask you wear." Lucien set his cup down with a soft clink. "I don't want to be a mask with you," he said, the words rough and halting as if dragged from a place he rarely visited. "But I'm afraid if I take it off, there'll be nothing left." Ivy reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. "Then let's find out together," she said. The connection between them deepened after that night, growing stronger with every stolen moment, every shared silence. Lucien began to confide in her, in halting fragments, stories of his isolated childhood in the glittering prison of wealth, his lonely ascent to power, the betrayal that taught him to trust no one. And Ivy in turn spoke of her own struggles, this mother she could never please, the debts that strangled her dreams, the battles fought and lost along the way. Their wounds were different, but the scars they carried were the same. One evening, as a late summer storm raged outside, they found themselves in the library again. Ivy sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, sorting through a box of old photographs she had found buried behind the shelves. Lucien lounged nearby, a rare glass of red wine in his hand. "Who's this?" Ivy asked, holding up a picture of a young boy, dark-haired and solemn, standing in front of an enormous Christmas tree. Lucien glanced over and gave a rare, unguarded laugh. "Me, age 10, the last Christmas before everything fell apart." Ivy studied the boy's serious face, the heavy sadness behind the proud stance. "You looked so lonely," she said softly. "I was." Without thinking, Ivy crawled across the floor and settled beside him, resting her head lightly against his knee. Lucien stiffened for a moment, then slowly relaxed. His free hand came to rest on her hair, tentative and uncertain. Outside, thunder rolled across the Parisian sky, but inside the library, there was only the crackle of the fire, the steady sound of two broken people finding comfort in each other. "Ivy," Lucien said after a long silence. She tilted her head up, meeting his gaze. "When the baby is born," he said, his voice low, "I don't want you to leave." The words hit her like a blow, not because she hadn't dreamed of hearing them, but because she was afraid to believe them. "Lucien," she began, but he shook his head. "No contracts, no conditions. I want you to stay, because you choose to, because you want to." Tears welled in Ivy's eyes. She had spent so long being used, bartered, discarded. She didn't know how to trust this. But looking into Lucien's eyes, seeing the raw, aching sincerity there, she thought maybe, just maybe, she could learn. "I want to stay," she whispered. And as Lucien leaned down, brushing his lips gently against her forehead, Ivy realized that what had begun as a transaction had somehow become something far more powerful, something real, something worth fighting. For the autumn crept into Paris with a quiet elegance, painting the skyline in shades of amber and crimson. Ivy Monroe often found herself wandering through the chateau's grounds, feeling the crisp bite of the air against her skin, letting the changing leaves mirror the turmoil swirling inside her. It should have been a time of peace, of anticipation, as her belly grew rounder and the baby's movements grew stronger, more insistent. Instead, an uneasy distance had crept back between her and Lucien Moreau, subtle and creeping like frost on a windowpane. At first she thought she was imagining it. The way Lucien would sometimes fall silent in the middle of their conversations, his eyes distant. The sudden business trips, longer and more frequent. the tension in his jaw when she mentioned plans for the baby's room. Each time she tried to reach out, he seemed to slip a little further away. One evening, unable to bear the growing silence between them, Ivy climbed the wide staircase to his study, her heart pounding against her ribs. The door was ajar, and she could hear Lucien's deep voice murmuring inside, tinged with the unmistakable coldness he reserved for business dealings. "I understand. As per the agreement, once the child is born, she will leave. I'll insure her. Debts are fully covered." Ivy froze, her hand hovering inches from the door. The voice on the other end of the call responded too faintly for her to hear, but it didn't matter. The words were a knife to the gut, swift and merciless. Agreement. Leave. All the fragile hope she had been nurturing, every shared laugh, every fleeting smile, every whispered confession in the dead of night, crumbled in an instant. She backed, away, her body moving on instinct alone, down the hallway and into the safety of her bedroom. Only when she shut the door behind her did she let the sobs tear free from her chest. It had been foolish, she realized now, to believe that someone like Lucien Moreau could ever truly open his heart to her. To think that a contract signed in, desperation could blossom into something real. She was still just a transaction, a neatly negotiated solution to a billionaire's inheritance problem, and she was expendable. For the next few days, Ivy buried herself in silence. She smiled when necessary, answered Lucien's polite inquiries with clipped words, and retreated to her room early each night. She cooked less, laughed never, and withdrew from the spaces they used to share so easily. Lucien noticed, of course. How could he not? One afternoon, as rain pelted the windows in silver sheets, he found her curled on the sofa in the library, a half-finished novel forgotten in her lap. "You've been distant," he said, his voice low and cautious. Ivy didn't look up. She traced the worn leather spine of the book with a fingertip, gathering her fraying composure like a threadbare cloak around herself. "I'm just tired," she said, her voice even. Lucien crossed the room and crouched before her, searching her face for a crack in her carefully constructed armor. "Talk to me, Ivy." At that, something inside her snapped. She lifted her gaze to meet his, and he must have seen it there. The hurt, the betrayal, the dawning realization that he had never intended for her to stay. "You already made your plans," she said quietly. "There's nothing to talk about." Lucien's frown deepened, confusion flickering across his features. "What are you talking about?" "You think I didn't hear you?" she whispered, tears burning her throat. "The call with your lawyer. Once the baby is born, I disappear. Just like that." Silence crashed over them, heavier than any words. Lucien's hands balled into fists at his sides, and for a moment Ivy thought he might deny it, might spin some careful lie. But then he exhaled, harsh and ragged, and she saw the truth in his eyes. "Ivy," he began, but the damage was done. "I was foolish," she said, rising unsteadily to her feet. "I thought—" Her voice broke and she pressed a hand against her belly, feeling the baby stir in response to her distress. "I thought maybe we were building something real, but to you I was always just a solution." Lucien stood too, towering over her, his face grim. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," he said hoarsely. "Then what was it supposed to be, Lucien?" she demanded. "A business transaction, a clean break." "I was protecting you," he said, almost pleading. Ivy laughed then, a sound so hollow it barely resembled laughter at all. "By planning to throw me away?" He stepped forward as if to touch her, but Ivy recoiled. "I won't be someone's convenience," she said, her voice shaking. "Not for money, not even for love." The word hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding. Lucien's jaw tightened, his fist clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Ivy, he began, but she shook her head. "Don't," she whispered. "Just don't." She left the library then, her steps heavy, her heart heavier. In the days that followed, the chateau became a tomb of all the unspoken words between them. They lived like polite strangers, exchanging only what was necessary, trapped in a suffocating dance of proximity and avoidance. Ivy focused on preparing for the baby, throwing herself into assembling the nursery alone. She ordered furniture online, built cribs with trembling hands, and painted walls in soft, soothing colors that mocked the chaos inside her. At night, she lay awake, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, whispering promises to the child she had yet to meet. "I'll protect you," she vowed, "even if it means walking away from everything." Lucien, for his part, seemed lost in his own private hell. She caught glimpses of him pacing the gardens at dawn, his phone clutched white-knuckled in his hand, or sitting for hours in the library, staring into the fire with a hollow look that scared her more than his anger ever could. One evening, as Ivy folded tiny clothes in the nursery, she heard a soft knock at the door. She ignored it. A moment later, it creaked open anyway, and Lucien stepped inside. He looked exhausted, dark circles shadowing his eyes, his usual polish undone by days of sleeplessness and regret. "Ivy," he said roughly, "please let me explain." She kept her hands busy, smoothing out a miniature onesie, refusing to meet his gaze. "I thought I could protect you by keeping you at a distance," he said, voice trembling. "That if I didn't let myself feel, it would be easier for you to walk away. Easier for both of us." Ivy folded another shirt with shaking hands. "But I was wrong," Lucien continued, stepping closer. "Because somewhere along the way, you became more than a contract. You became the only thing that felt real." Finally, she looked up. The walls he had spent a lifetime building were gone, stripped away, until only the man remained, raw, broken, and desperately trying to piece himself back together. "I don't know how to love properly," he said, a shudder running through him. "But I want to learn. With you." The words were a balm and a blade all at once. Ivy crossed the room slowly until she stood inches from him. She searched his face, looking for some sign that this was just another lie. But she found none. "Actions, Lucien," she said softly. "Not promises." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll prove it," he whispered. Tentatively, he reached out and placed his palm over her belly. The baby kicked in response, a swift, decisive nudge that made them both gasp. Lucien smiled then, a real unguarded smile, and Ivy felt her own. Lips curve in response despite everything. Maybe they were both broken. Maybe they had made 1,000 mistakes. But standing there, wrapped in the fragile, fierce bond of the life they had created together, Ivy dared to believe that broken things could still be beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, they could heal together. The first snow of winter dusted the grounds of the Moreau Chateau in a soft blanket of white, muffling the usual sounds of the bustling city beyond its walls. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but still. Ivy Monroe paced the grand sitting room, her hands protectively cradling the prominent swell of her belly, her heart pounding in an anxious rhythm that seemed to echo off the high-vaulted ceilings. The contractions had begun at dawn, sharp, undeniable, and had only grown stronger with each passing hour. Lucien had wanted to rush her to the hospital the moment she winced, but Ivy, stubborn as always, insisted on waiting until the timing was right. She didn't want to be tethered to a sterile hospital, bed longer than necessary. She wanted to feel every moment of this journey, every tremor, every gasp, every triumph of bringing new life into the world. Lucien hovered nearby, unable to sit still. The ever-composed billionaire, the man who could command boardrooms with a single icy glance, was now reduced to pacing the floors, wringing his hands like a novice about to enter uncharted territory. His blue eyes, usually so calm and calculating, were wide and frantic, his voice gruff every time he asked, "Are you sure we shouldn't go now?" Ivy smiled through the pain, her hand finding his. "I'm sure," she whispered, squeezing his fingers gently. "Stay with me, Lucien. We'll go when it's time." She didn't say it aloud, but she needed him there. Not just as a chauffeur or protector, but as the man she had fallen for, flaws and all. She needed to feel that connection between them, that tether of shared strength before she embarked on the terrifying, beautiful plunge into motherhood. Finally, as twilight bled into night and the pain became too fierce to deny, Ivy nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. It's time. The drive through the snow-blanketed streets to the hospital was a blur of white lights and clenched hands. Lucien gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned pale, his every glance at Ivy filled with helpless panic. She fought through each contraction with deep, controlled breaths, leaning her head back against the seat and focusing on the steady sound of his voice, murmuring reassurances beside her. "You're doing amazing," he said hoarsely. "We're almost there, just hold on." At the hospital, everything accelerated. Nurses rushed her into a delivery room, IV lines were attached, monitors beeped frantically, and Lucien, still in his tailored coat and cashmere scarf, was left clinging to her hand like a lifeline. Ivy's labor was long, arduous, and unrelenting. For hours she fought through the pain, her body racked with waves of agony that seemed to strip her down to her most primal core. She screamed, she cried, she gasped for breath. There were moments when she thought she couldn't go on. when exhaustion gnawed at her bones and despair threatened to steal her resolve. But every time her grip on Lucien's hand weakened, he tightened his hold. "I'm here," he whispered over and over, his voice breaking. "You're not alone." Through the haze of pain, Ivy saw the fear in his eyes, the raw terror of a man powerless to ease the suffering of the woman he loved. It was that sight, more than anything, that gave her the strength to keep pushing forward. After what felt like a lifetime and a heartbeat all at once, a baby's wail shattered the sterile quiet of the room. A tiny, furious, beautiful cry. Ivy sagged, back against the pillows, tears streaming down her cheeks as a nurse placed the wriggling newborn against her chest. The baby's skin was slick and flushed, her dark tufts of hair damp with birth, her tiny fists flailing against the newness of the world. "Hello, little one," Ivy sobbed, cradling the baby close. "Welcome to the world." Lucien stood frozen at her side, staring at the tiny life in awe. His face, usually a fortress of restraint, crumpled as he knelt beside the bed, brushing a trembling hand over the baby's soft head. "You did it," he whispered hoarsely, pressing his forehead to Ivy's shoulder. "You're incredible." Tears filled his eyes, unashamed and unhidden. For a long, sacred moment, the three of them stayed like that, mother, father, and child tangled, together in the raw, messy wonder of first beginnings. Later, as the hospital room fell into a hushed lull, Ivy watched Lucien from the bed, the baby sleeping soundly against her chest. He sat in the corner, his coat discarded, his hair rumpled, his posture slumped with exhaustion. Yet there was a peace in him that she had never seen before. He looked up, catching her gaze. "Ivy," he said softly, rising to his feet and crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps. "I need to tell you something." She smiled faintly, already weary but curious. He sat beside her, his hand gentle as he stroked the baby's tiny back. "You changed me," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Before you, I thought I understood love. I thought I could control it, negotiate it, put boundaries around it, but you..." He shook his head, a tear slipping down his cheek. "You shattered all of that. You made me realize love isn't a contract or a bargain, it's surrender. And I want to surrender to it, to you, to her." Ivy's breath caught in her throat. "I'm not perfect," he continued. "I'll mess up. I'll say the wrong thing. But I'll never walk away. I'll never treat you like a deal again. You are my life, Ivy. You and our daughter." The vulnerability in his confession pierced straight through her bruised heart. She reached out, threading her fingers through his. "You're already enough," she whispered. And in that moment, surrounded by the soft beeping of monitors and the quiet breathing of their newborn daughter, Ivy knew that everything they had endured, the pain, the fear, the heartbreak, had led them here. To this beginning. To this family. Lucien bent and kissed her forehead. Then the baby's, his touch reverent and awed. "I love you," he murmured, the words weighty and real. Ivy closed her eyes, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. Love was not perfect. It was messy and terrifying and often born from the most broken places. But it was real. And sometimes, when you least expected it, it was enough to heal even the deepest wounds. That night, as snow fell silently outside the hospital window, Ivy slept with her daughter cradled in her arms and Lucien's arms around them both, finally, blissfully home. After the whirlwind of the birth, the hours that followed seemed to pass in a surreal haze. Ivy lay awake while Lucien dozed in the armchair. Beside her, their newborn daughter nestled in the crook of her arm. The hospital room was dim except for the faint glow from a small lamp on the nightstand, casting a warm, tender light across the scene. She marveled at the perfect tiny features of her baby, the delicate curve of her nose, the faintest suggestion of a dimple in her cheek, the miniature fingers curling around her thumb with surprising strength. Ivy couldn't help but wonder at how something so small could feel so infinitely big, how one little life could so thoroughly rearrange her entire world. Emotions tumbled through her like waves. Awe, exhaustion, fear, gratitude. She pressed a soft kiss to the baby's forehead, breathing in the sweet, milky scent of her skin. It was a moment she wished she could bottle and keep forever, untarnished and pure. Lucien stirred beside her, waking with a soft grunt. When his eyes met hers, his usual stoicism cracked wide open. He rose, kneeling by the bed, and without a word rested his forehead against her arm, his hand lightly cupping the baby's back. "I keep thinking I'm dreaming," he murmured, "that I'll wake up and none of this will be real." Ivy smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "It's real," she whispered. "She's real. We're real." Lucien lifted his head, his eyes shining. I was so afraid, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Afraid I would fail you both. Afraid I wouldn't know how to be the man you deserve. You already are, Ivy said softly, her heart aching at the vulnerability, etched into his features. You don't have to be perfect, Lucian, you just have to be here. You just have to try. He laughed quietly, a sound full of both relief and wonder. Then I'll keep trying every day. They sat like that for a long time, the three of them cocooned, in their fragile, perfect little world. Outside, the snow continued to fall, cloaking the city in silence. But inside the room, there was a warmth that no winter chill could touch. When a nurse came by to check Ivy's vitals, Lucian reluctantly let go of their daughter, placing her carefully in the bassinet. He watched every movement with hawk-like protectiveness, and Ivy smiled, realizing that the ruthless businessman who once negotiated deals with chilling precision was now utterly undone by a 6-pound bundle swaddled in a pink blanket. Later that night, as Ivy dozed lightly, Lucian sat by the window, cradling his daughter in his arms. He spoke to her in low, hushed tones, words that Ivy could only half hear in her half-sleep. You'll never know how much you've changed me, he whispered, his voice breaking. You and your mother, you're my beginning, my chance to be better. He pressed a kiss to the baby's forehead, a silent vow. Over the next few days, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Ivy and the baby remained in the hospital under observation while Lucian transformed into a fiercely attentive father. He learned how to swaddle, to feed, to change diapers, though with many clumsy attempts that left both Ivy and the nurses laughing. Every small victory was celebrated. The first successful diaper change without a disaster, the first time he's rocked the baby to sleep on his own, the first time he managed to burp her without looking like he was handling a live grenade. For a man who had spent his life mastering financial markets, corporate takeovers, and high-stakes negotiations, it was humbling. And yet Ivy could see how each tiny challenge reshaped him, softened him, melted away another layer of the armor he had spent so long building around his heart. One evening, as Ivy prepared to finally take their daughter home, she caught Lucian, standing at the edge of the hospital nursery, staring through the glass at the rows of newborns bundled up like little burritos. His expression was so raw, so unguarded, that it brought tears to her eyes. You're a natural, she said softly, coming up beside him. He shook his head with a rueful smile. Hardly. I've never felt so out of my depth in my life. But you're trying, she said, slipping her hand into his. And that's what matters. They brought their daughter, whom they had decided to name Amélie Grace, home to the chateau 2 days later. The grand halls, once echoing and cold, now filled with new sounds. The tiny cries of a newborn, the soft coos of Ivy comforting her, the occasional shouts of Lucian fumbling through diaper changes or bottle feedings. It wasn't perfect. There were sleepless nights, endless laundry, moments when Ivy felt like she might burst into tears from sheer exhaustion. But there were also moments of stunning beauty. Amélie's first real smile, her tiny fingers wrapping around Lucien's. Much larger one, the sight of Lucien dozing on the couch with Amélie sleeping peacefully against his chest. One night, after an especially difficult evening of colic and tears, Ivy collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I can't do this, she whispered, feeling the hot sting of tears. Lucian sat down beside her, pulling her into his arms without a word. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply held her, letting her cry against his shoulder, anchoring her through the storm of her own emotions. When her sobs finally subsided, he kissed the top of her head and whispered, You're not alone, Ivy. You never will be. And somehow that was enough. In the weeks that followed, they learned together. They stumbled, they fumbled, but they did it as a team. Each day brought new lessons in patience, resilience, and unconditional love. Lucien transformed before Ivy's eyes, not into someone new, but into the man he had always been beneath the layers of ice and fear. A man capable of boundless love, fierce devotion, and breathtaking tenderness. And Ivy? She found in herself a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The strength to love without reservation, to hope without fear, to build a life rooted not in desperation, but in faith and joy. One snowy morning, as they sat together in the nursery watching Amélie sleep, Lucien turned to Ivy, his blue eyes, full of something deep and reverent. I don't want this to end, he said simply. I don't want to live another day without you by my side. Tears filled Ivy's eyes. It doesn't have to, she whispered. And right there in the soft golden light of their daughter's nursery, Lucian pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple, stunning diamond ring. "Marry me," he said, his voice shaking with hope. Ivy laughed through her tears, pressing her forehead to his. "We're already a family," she whispered. "But yes, I'll marry you." Lucian kissed her then, long and deep and full of every unspoken promise he had ever made. Their journey had begun with desperation and a deal made in the dark, but it had become something far greater, a love forged through fire, tested by fear, and blessed by the tiny miracle sleeping between them, a family, a forever. The days following their quiet engagement unfolded in a golden haze of simple shared moments. Ivy and Lucian returned to the chateau, where the grand halls no longer seemed cold and cavernous, but instead resonated with the small, vivid signs of a life they were building. Ivy's laughter as she carried Amélie through the halls echoed against the ancient stone walls. Lucian's low voice, reading stories aloud late into the night, softened the once sharp edges of the estate. Though the outside world still bustled with expectations and obligations, Lucian began to loosen his iron grip on it. His meetings were scheduled around Amélie's nap times. He turned down high-profile deals if they demanded his attention during Ivy's doctor's appointments or important milestones. Slowly, the man who once measured success in profit margins began to define his victories in smiles, in quiet evenings by the fire, in the sound of his daughter's soft breathing against his chest. One evening, as twilight melted into a velvet night, Ivy stood at the window watching the soft swirling snowflakes fall over the chateau gardens. She held Amélie against her shoulder, the baby's tiny body warm and trusting in her arms. She didn't hear Lucien approach until his arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting lightly on her shoulder. "She's so small," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "And yet she holds the whole world in her." Ivy smiled, brushing her fingertips over Amélie's downy hair. "She saved me," she murmured. "And you did too." Lucien turned her carefully to face him, his hands cradling her face with a gentleness that still surprised her sometimes. "No, Ivy, you saved me." They stayed like that for a long time, breathing each other in, finding strength in the quiet, certainty between them. The storm outside thickened, but inside their little world there was only warmth. Still, as blissful as the days were, they both knew that healing was never a straight road. Lucien carried with him the scars of his past, the deep-seated fear that love was fragile, conditional, something that could be stolen away. And Ivy battled her own shadows. The memory of betrayal, the fear of depending on someone again after years of relying only on herself. It was a fragile dance between them, balancing hope and fear, tenderness and hesitation. One cold afternoon, as Ivy was folding Amélie's tiny clothes in the nursery, Lucien entered the room, his phone pressed against his ear, his voice sharp and cold, the tone of the man he used to be. "No extensions," he said curtly. "We move forward, with or without them. No sentimentality." The conversation ended with a sharp click as he tossed the phone onto a chair. He caught Ivy watching him, her arms full of Amélie's onesies, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the old distance yawned between them, the chasm built not of anger but of old habits, of pain unspoken. "I'm sorry," he said gruffly, raking a hand through his hair. "Old reflexes. It's not who I want to be anymore." Ivy smiled softly, her eyes tender. "It's part of you. I never wanted to change you, Lucien. Just to remind you that you don't have to fight the world alone anymore." Lucien crossed the room in 2 strides, taking the tiny clothes from her arms and placing them gently in the drawer. Then he cupped her face again, pressing his forehead against hers. "With you," he whispered, "I'm finally not alone." It was not a perfect moment. It was real, tangled with flaws and history and unspoken fears, but it was more beautiful because of it. As winter deepened, their bond grew stronger. Ivy resumed some of her freelance writing, setting up a cozy workspace in the sunroom where she could watch the snow-dusted gardens while working and keeping Amélie close. Lucien surprised her one morning by installing a new desk and chair, the kind she had once wistfully admired in a magazine, complete with a small shelf where Amélie's toys could be stored. "You deserve a space that feels like yours," he said simply when she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. And in turn, Ivy did small things that spoke volumes, slipping handwritten notes into Lucien's briefcase, cooking his favorite meals when he returned from long meetings, making sure he had a fresh cup of coffee waiting in the mornings, brewed just the way he liked. They found joy in the everyday. Late-night feedings turned into whispered conversations under soft lamplight. Walks through the snow became opportunities to dream about the future. schools, vacations, a little dog that Amélie could chase around the chateau grounds. One night, as a blizzard howled outside, Ivy awoke to find Lucien not beside her but standing by Amélie's crib, watching their daughter sleep. His expression was so raw, so full of awe and protectiveness that Ivy felt her breath catch in her throat. "She's everything I never knew I needed," he said quietly when he realized she was awake. "You both are." Ivy crossed the room, slipping her hand into his. "And you're everything I never dared to hope for." They stood there for a long while, hands clasped, hearts full, as the storm raged outside, and their daughter slept peacefully between them. Spring came slowly to the chateau. The snow melted, giving way to carpets of wildflowers that turned the once barren grounds into a riot of color. Ivy planted a small herb garden in a corner of the courtyard, her hands sinking into the rich earth as Lucien watched, Amélie strapped against his chest in a soft carrier, cooing happily. "Careful," he said, half teasing, half serious. "You're turning my estate into a farm." She laughed, brushing dirt off her hands and rising to kiss his cheek. "Maybe you need a little more wildness in your life." Lucien smiled, a real full smile that reached his eyes. "I already have it. I have you." One evening, after Amélie had been put to bed, and the chateau was bathed in the soft glow of 1,000 candles Ivy had insisted on lighting, Lucien led her to the great hall, the one that had once felt so cold and empty, but tonight it was transformed. A small string quartet played quietly in the corner. The floors were scattered with rose petals. In the center, a simple table was set for two, surrounded by flickering candles. Ivy gasped, tears springing to her eyes. "What's all this?" she whispered. Lucien took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "A celebration. Of us. Of the life you gave me when you walked into it." They danced that night. Slow, clumsy, full of laughter and stolen kisses. And when Lucien led her out onto the terrace to watch the stars, Ivy rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You once told me. You were afraid of love," she murmured. Lucien tightened his arms around her. "I'm still afraid," he admitted. "But loving you, Ivy, it's the bravest thing I've ever done." She lifted her head to meet his gaze, her heart swelling with an emotion so fierce it nearly overwhelmed her. "And it's the bravest thing I've ever done too," she whispered, as the stars spun silently above them as the soft sounds of their daughter's breathing drifted from the nursery. Ivy and Lucien held each other, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not as two people bound by a desperate deal, but as a family, as a home, as a love that would not let go. As spring ripened into early summer, the world around the chateau exploded into life. Ivy often sat on the stone terrace barefoot, Amélie cradled against her chest as she watched Lucien tend to the roses he had planted just for her. There was a rhythm to their days now, a harmony that had once seemed impossible but had quietly woven itself into the very walls of their home. Yet even in that peace, Ivy sometimes felt a quiet hum of uncertainty beneath the surface, like a distant storm she couldn't quite see but could sense nonetheless. One evening, after Ivy had put Amélie down to sleep, she found Lucien in the study, a fire crackling in the grand hearth. He was seated in his armchair, a document in hand, but his eyes weren't moving across the page. He was simply staring, lost in thought. Ivy crossed the room and sat on the floor by his feet, resting her chin on his knee. "What's troubling you?" she asked softly. Lucien set the paper down and ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign he was struggling for words. After a long silence, he said, "I've been offered a position in New York, a seat on one of the largest investment boards in the world. It would mean relocating." Ivy's heart squeezed tight. New York. The very thought of uprooting their life, of leaving behind the home they had fought so hard to build, made her chest ache. "What do you want?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay even. Lucien's gaze dropped to hers, his hand cupping her cheek. "I want you. I want Amélie. Everything else. I'm starting to realize it means nothing without you both." Ivy smiled through the sting of tears. "Then stay. Let's build something here. Not just wealth or reputation, but a real life. A messy, beautiful life." Lucien nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Then here we stay." In the following weeks, life deepened even further. Ivy's herb garden flourished, and Lucien spent lazy afternoons reading under the cherry trees, Amélie gurgling, happily beside him. They hosted small gatherings with friends Ivy had made in the nearby village, an author, a baker, a retired painter who taught Amélie how to hum. The chateau became a living thing, no longer just a relic of Lucien's dynasty, but a breathing testament to love reclaimed and reborn. Still, there were tests they hadn't foreseen. Late one night, Amélie fell sick. A high fever gripped her tiny body, and panic tightened Ivy's throat until she could barely breathe. Lucien drove them through the dark countryside to the hospital, his jaw clenched, his hand white-knuckled on the steering wheel, in the sterile hospital room. Ivy held Amélie close, whispering lullabies through tears, while Lucien paced the floor, helplessness gnawing at him. When the doctor finally reassured them that it was a simple infection and that Amélie would be fine with rest and medicine, Lucien sank into the chair beside the bed and buried his face in his hands. Ivy reached out, resting her hand on his shoulder. "We're okay," she whispered. "She's okay. We're a team, remember?" He looked up at her then, eyes raw. "I've never been this afraid before." Ivy leaned her forehead against his. "Neither have I. But it's okay to be afraid. It just means we have something worth everything." That night, crammed together in the small hospital bed with Amélie between them, Lucien realized just how far he had come. He wasn't the man who made deals to control his future anymore. He was the man who would hold his daughter through the fevered nights, who would anchor Ivy when fear gripped her heart, who would choose love over power 1,000 times over. As the seasons turned, so did the pages of their life. Amélie took her first steps across the sun-drenched terrace, tottering into Lucien's outstretched arms. Ivy watched, heart bursting, as Lucien lifted their daughter high into the air, his laughter, full, unguarded, echoing across the gardens. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Ivy and Lucien stood together beneath the ancient oak in the courtyard, Amélie toddling between them. Lucien took Ivy's hands, his eyes serious but shining. "I don't want just to live with you, Ivy," he said, voice low. "I want to marry you, truly. Not for debt or contracts or bargains, for love, for family, for every messy, beautiful moment to come." Ivy's heart, already so full, seemed to overflow. She laughed through her tears, nodding fiercely. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Their wedding was small and perfect, held right there in the courtyard under the golden leaves, with Amélie toddling down the makeshift aisle carrying a basket of petals. Ivy wore a simple dress of soft lace, her hair loose around her shoulders, and Lucien looked at her as though she were the very heart of the earth. When they exchanged vows, Lucien's voice broke, and he didn't even try to hide it. "I once thought love was a weakness. Now I know it's my greatest strength. You, Ivy, are my greatest strength." Ivy's hands trembled slightly as she slid the ring onto his finger. "You once asked me for a child in exchange for paying my debt, but you gave me so much more. You gave me a home, a future, a family." As they kissed, as cheers and laughter filled the courtyard, Lucien lifted Ivy in his arms and spun her around, the world a blur of light and color and joy. And so they began again, not as strangers bound by desperation, not as people healing from past wounds, but as soulmates stepping into the bright unknown together. They traveled with Amélie to new cities, showing her the wide, wonderful world. They weathered small storms and celebrated small victories. Some days were hard, some were so perfect they hardly dared to breathe for fear of breaking the spell. But through it all, they chose each other, again and again and again, in the years to come. Whenever Ivy looked at Lucien, whether across a candlelit dinner table or in the sleepy hush of midnight feedings, she would remember the woman she had once been, the woman who thought she had no right to hope, and she would remember the night she had gambled everything on a man she barely knew, only to find a love greater than anything she had dared dream. For Lucien and Ivy, the greatest deal ever made, wasn't written in ink or sealed with signatures. It was written in shared glances, whispered promises, tiny hands clasped between them. It was sealed with a kiss, a vow, and the steady, relentless beating of two hearts that had finally, gloriously found their way home, forever. Throughout their journey, Ivy Bennet and Lucien, Moreau taught us that life often leads us down unexpected, even painful paths, but it is often through those very struggles that we discover our deepest strength and truest love. Ivy, burdened by crushing debt and broken dreams, made a desperate choice to save herself and her family. Lucien hardened by years of emotional isolation, made a calculated offer that neither could have predicted would lead to real happiness. Together, they navigated misunderstandings, heartbreaks, and the delicate process of trusting someone enough to break down lifelong walls. Their story shows us that love is not a sudden explosion of emotion. It is built slowly through small acts of care, moments of vulnerability, and the decision to stay even when it's difficult. Ivy and Lucien learned that a life worth living is not made through perfect plans or grand gestures, but through daily commitment, forgiveness, and the courage to embrace change. The lesson here is profound. Sometimes the very things we fear most, opening our hearts, risking disappointment, stepping into the unknown, are the keys to the life we have always dreamed of. In today's fast-paced, often transactional world, Ivy and Lucien's story reminds us that true connection cannot be negotiated like a business deal. It must be nurtured with patience, kindness, and an open heart. For all of us, the takeaway is clear. No matter where you come from or what you've endured, you are never too broken to find healing. You are never too lost to find your way home. To love, to family, to joy. All it takes is the courage to say yes when life offers you an unexpected second chance. Now, let's have a little fun and test your memory. Here's a small quiz. Question: what was the original agreement between Ivy and Lucien? A. Ivy would work for Lucien as his personal assistant. B. Ivy would have Lucien's child in exchange for clearing her debt. Comment your answer A or B below. Let's see how many of you were truly following their journey. Also, I would love to hear your thoughts. What was the most emotional or inspiring moment in Ivy and Lucien's story for you? Please comment and share your feelings. Everyone's perspective adds so much richness to our community. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and support us so we can continue creating more heartfelt, inspiring stories just for you. Let's grow this beautiful space of love, hope, and second chances together.